Okay, welcome and welcome back. It's time for us to start a new section. And a new section, it means that we'll have new information and new insight. And with new insight and new information also comes new challenges, right? This is going to challenge us to a whole different dimension of our spiritual journey. That's the goal. That's what we would like to achieve. That's the advantage of learning. Every learning comes with a cost, yes? No, nothing for nothing. You know what the Gemara says? That when the Jewish people were in the desert and they complained, as Jews do, and they complained about food, as Jews do. So one of the things that they said is, we remember that when we were in Egypt, we ate fish and it was free. And of course the sages wondered, what do you mean it was free? It was definitely not free. What do you mean free? There's no such thing as free when you're a slave in Egypt. So the sages explain what they were trying to say is it was free of the responsibility of mitzvahs. And that's what people look for in this world of ours, in this modern world of ours. Everybody wants a free ride. Everybody wants to learn about the inspiring stuff. They want to hear, tell me something that's going to move me, tell me something that's going to describe the spiritual realms or the nature of my soul or whatever it might be. But please let it come at no cost. I don't want to have to change. I don't want to have to work. I don't want to have to do the tough stuff. And Judaism says, I'm afraid that's not how we operate. Because it's wonderful to learn all of this information, but it's meaningless information if you don't do something with it. And if you don't take the challenge and you don't put yourself out there and do the tough stuff. So let's review what we've learned up until now, which quite honestly was very spiritual, very uplifting, but hadn't yet really made demands on us. And we'll compare that to what we're about to discover in this chapter, which is, okay, now we're going to have to start doing some personal work. So this is what we've got so far. We began our conversation by saying, before your soul even entered this world, it already made commitments. That's like a really Jewish thing. You make commitments even before you know what it is that you're committing to. It's called Naaseh v'Nishma. When the Jews were at the foot of Mount Sinai and God said, would you like the Torah? They said, absolutely, we're in. Not like every other smart nation on earth who wanted to hear the fine print. What exactly does this entail? We were like, yeah, Naaseh v'Nishma. Many, many generations later, there was a great Jewish sage of the Talmudic era, and he was traveling along and he came face to face with a Tzeduki. Those were the Sadducees, the people who denied the validity of the oral Torah. And in those days they spoke Aramaic, and he said to him, Amma Peziza. You know what kind of people you are? You're a very reckless nation. Because what you do is, de kadmisu pumaichu leudnaichu. You put your mouths ahead of your ears. In other words, you commit yourself verbally before you've heard what you're committing yourself to. So that's exactly how we began this journey, because we quoted a Gemara that says that even before your soul came into this world, it spoke up and said, all right, this is what I'm willing to do. I'm in. I'm committed. I'm going to do all these wonderful things. And your soul made an oath. And the oath was that you would be a tzaddik and that you would not be a rasha. And then the Talmud adds to that and says, you know what that means? That means that even if the entire world, everybody you know, swears to the fact that you are a tzaddik, a righteous individual, don't believe them. Don't believe them. Isn't that funny? It's a funny Jewish attitude, right? If people say nice things about you, don't believe them. If they say that you're a tzaddik, you should view yourself as if you are a rasha. Now, at this point, we don't know the full extent of what we're going to study in Tanya. So what we know at this point is that a tzaddik is the most righteous, pious person that you could be, and a rasha is the worst kind of person you should be. So that's why we had a question. First of all, how does your soul promise that you're going to be a tzaddik before it knows what it's up against? Second of all, why should you live your whole life thinking of yourself that you are kerasha, like a wicked person, if at the end of the day, that could be really self-defeating? You could walk around pretty down, I think, when you consider, doesn't matter how much I've done, doesn't matter how much I've learned, doesn't matter how much I've grown. Everybody thinks I'm brilliant, but I know the truth. I am like a rasha. So why would you think that? And of course, in true Jewish fashion, we say, if you really want an answer to that question, you first have to ask at least one other question. And so we began a whole series of questions about what is a tzaddik, what is a rasha, and what is the individual in the middle who they call a Beinoni, the so-called average person. What exactly is an average person if you're talking about spirituality? And that's what set us on our journey. And we came to the conclusion early on that a tzaddik is not just a nice person, and a rasha is not the worst criminal on earth. Actually, a rasha is any person who does something against what Hashem would want for any amount of time. And the reality is that a Beinoni is an elusive concept, this person who lies somewhere in the middle, and we really have to find out more about it. So we said, okay, you want to find out more about it, then we need to ask another question. Because that's how we roll as Jewish people. We ask many questions. We ask questions about questions. We ask questions to answer questions. So we had another question. And the other question was, what are we actually made of? Everybody always says we're made of a body and a soul. And depending on exactly how you look at it, of course, some people say we are bodies that are powered by souls, and other people say, no. We are souls that temporarily inhabit bodies. Truth of the matter is, neither one of those is absolutely accurate. As we learned at the end of the first chapter, we are two souls fighting for control of a body. We'll actually learn more about that in chapter 9, please God, about the fight between the two souls. But the fact is that there are two souls. One soul, the first one that we encounter early on in life, is very impulsive, kind of behaves like an animal, cares about itself, it's interested in preservation, it is interested in anything that makes it feel good. So that soul of ours, the first soul that we encounter, can lead us to all kinds of bad behavior. And at the end of the first chapter, we said that that's what happens. So if a person becomes arrogant, or easy to anger, or hedonistic, or lazy, all of those and various other things are because we allow the impulsive soul just to take over and do as it pleases. It's not inherently bad, but it is inherently impulsive. And we all know that impulsive behavior can land you in a real mess. Chapter 2 said, but now's the good news. Yes, of course, you have an animal soul, this impulsive side, but you are a godly soul. That's an important distinction. You have an animal soul, but you are a godly soul. As we described it, literally a piece of God living inside a human form. Now, this is not pantheism. This is an understanding that inside every single one of us is a spark of God, just like there is that very, on the one hand, tiny, yet on the other hand, essence piece of DNA that we get from our parents. And that makes us who we are. And do what you want, run as far as you try, you cannot uncouple yourself from the DNA of your parents. And that's exactly how it is with our real soul. You could run and scream and misbehave and rebel and deny God and do all of those things. Doesn't change your DNA. That's who you are. That's your soul. Okay, so that's great. Let's find out a little bit more. Next question. How does that soul operate? What are the facets of that soul? What makes that soul? That was chapter 3. So chapter 3 said that that soul is comprised of 10 different facets, and they're divided into two groups. One group is what we call seichel. I think everybody knows what seichel is, right? Everybody hopes that they have some. Seichel is supposed to be intellect. Seichel is supposed to be what distinguishes us from various other creatures, the ability to think, the ability to innovate, the ability to be creative. That's the soul. That's what makes the soul operate, its intellectual faculties. And then it has another side to it as well, which is how you respond to the intellectual realizations that you have. So anytime, this is the way humans operate, anytime that you become aware of something in a deep and a meaningful and a personal way, you will always respond to it, you'll react to it. So the minute you become aware of the fact that something is meaningful and valuable, your response is, I would like to be part of that. I'd like to engage with it. And that's what we call a so-called ahav or love response, which is basically to be magnetized towards something, as opposed to other things we realize, oh my gosh, that's really not good for me. And then you get a Euro response, which is the flight response. Let me get out of here. This is not good for me. It's an unhealthy environment. I want to go. And so we said, if we really want to understand how the soul operates, we've got to focus in on the intellectual components of the soul, because that's where the magic lies. And we said there are three stages: Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'as. Chokhmah is when you innovate, or when you first encounter a topic or a concept for the first time, and it's like, wow, and you're blown away and everything's really exciting. And you think the whole world has just changed until, of course, 2 minutes later when you get distracted by WhatsApp. And then, of course, you forget everything that you've learned because there's something more pressing happening at the moment, as the motivational speakers will tell you the difference between urgent and important things. So that's Chokhmah. It's like, pew, something happened and it illuminated my eyes intellectually. Bina is the slog work of trying to understand what exactly just happened. What information did I just encounter? What does it really mean? How does it really apply? How am I supposed to understand it? Etc., etc. That's the Bina process. And then we learned at the end of the third chapter that the most important step in the entire process is where you translate information from theory into personal reality. And that's called Da'as. Da'as is the intellectual ability to take something from the abstract and to own it, so that it's no longer book knowledge, it's no longer something I can give a speech on in a public forum, but it's actually how I live my life. So what do we know so far? We know that somehow or another we promised that we were going to be a tzaddik and not be a rasha, and we're not exactly sure what a tzaddik or a rasha is. We do know that in order to understand that, we'll need to know the two different souls and how they operate, which has led us to discuss the internal operating system of the soul. But at this point, we have to ask another question. Remember, Jews ask many questions. How do you know you're hanging out with a Jewish crowd? Well, that was a question already, right there. So how do you know? Because people are asking about everything that the rest of the world just kind of takes for granted. So we now have another question. You've told me all these wonderful things about how the soul operates in its internal workings, the intellectual neuropathways, the emotional responses, which are great, but a soul is intrinsically a spiritual being, and I don't live in a spiritual world. Maybe you do. I know that I don't. I live in a tangible world, which is basically a place where, quite honestly, people complain. That's one of the symptoms of living in a tangible physical world. People complain. And what do they complain about? Well, the weather's too hot or too cold. The beds are too comfortable or uncomfortable. Too comfortable, you can't get out in the morning. Too uncomfortable, you can't sleep at night. We complain about leadership, political leadership, spiritual leadership, whatever. That's the reality. It's great that I have the soul. It's very beautiful and very inspiring, and I've got the spark of God inside of myself. But how do I create the interface between whatever powerful spiritual pack I've got on the inside and the reality of the world that I'm living in every single day? How do I get my neshama into the traffic jam so that instead of yelling and gesticulating at the driver in front of me, who quite frankly doesn't even notice that I'm doing any of it, so I'm just entertaining or frustrating myself, and the person who's causing me that frustration is completely oblivious. So either I'm doing that, or there's a way to get the soul involved. Excuse me. And maybe the soul is another perspective altogether, and maybe it's got this grand, bird's eye view of the whole of life. Or even simply, let's say I've got this pulsating soul inside of myself. How do I touch somebody else with that soul? And perhaps the most pressing question of the lot, how do I get in touch with my soul? Because what we've learned in the previous chapter, which is basically about the intellectual process and about the emotional response, doesn't yet tell me soul. It just tells me about faculties that I could use for my soul, but I could equally use for other things. In other words, the three stages of intellect, do they have to be reserved only for the soul, or could you use them if you've got a big exam coming up and you've got to study for that exam? Or if you're trying to crack the code of some kind of DNA sequence that you can come up with a better response to the COVID virus. I don't know. Do you only use Chokhmah, Bina, and Das for your soul? No. So how do I engage my soul? And that's what we're going to start to learn in this fourth chapter. This is really important information because this is information that drills right down to what on the one hand is the most what would appear to be superficial part of us, and yet the irony is that sometimes it's dafka, the superficial part of us, that stimulates the deep meaningful part of us. Isn't that interesting? And it's probably fair to say that that's a theme in various places in Judaism. Here's one, just because of the time of the year. we know that we're headed towards Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And for many people, that's a very overwhelming time. And wow, you've really got to get your spiritual ducks in a row, and you've got to sort yourself out, because otherwise, who knows what's going to happen next year. And it's this very sensitive time of connection to God. So it's a very soulful time. Would you agree? Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is a soulful time. So what do we do as one of the main motifs of not only Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but the whole run-up, the 30 days before? We take a ram's horn. Now, I don't know, perhaps somebody listening is a big music aficionado, you know. I'm sure that all of you would agree that a shofar is not exactly an orchestral piece, right? Nobody goes, we're going to hear Chazan Goldblatt's third shofar movement, you know, on Broadway. Nobody's doing that. Carnegie Hall, they're bringing out the shofar, you know. So it's definitely not there for its orchestral value, right? So what is the shofar? Is the shofar musical? Not so much. Is the shofar mystical? Maybe, if you're that way inclined. I'm sure you can find a whole meditation associated. But the reality is that a shofar is primarily primal, simple, basic, animal. Now you got to ask yourself a question. If I'm looking to stimulate my soul, why would I bring out the horn of a dead animal? Surely there are other ways to stimulate my soul. Maybe we should have a meditation in the park, or sit next to running water and allow the principle of the sound of water to represent the flow of divine energy into the world. I don't know, there are various things, I'm sure. Must be some really creative people out there. Maybe you can come up with an idea, an alternative to the shofar. Instead, we got this jarring blast of the shofar. Why? Because there is an emerging theme in many areas in Judaism, particularly in the spiritual elements of Judaism, that sometimes that which appears to be most superficial, ironically, keys right into that which is deepest. Interesting, isn't it? So, for example, if you want to create a group of unconscious people, give a sophisticated high-level lecture. Then you'll have a whole lot of people who are out for the count. If you want to wake a person from an unconscious state, don't give them a sophisticated lecture or some meditation. Can you imagine there's a person lying there out cold. You're waiting for Hatzalah to arrive and you sit there doing a meditation with them. Doesn't really make sense. So what do? You do jarring things, right? You kind of shake them and you shout their name and maybe slap their face a little bit, whatever it is that you do to try and wake them up. So it's interesting that there's this ironic reality that sometimes the things that are what appear to be the most superficial things somehow connect right to the depth of everything. And that's what's going to happen as we go into this next journey of discovery of the soul. We're going to discover that the soul has certain facets about it that appear to be just so superficial, and yet they hold the keys to get directly to the soul itself. Now, what we're going to use as the primary theme, the primary metaphor through this chapter is clothing. So let's talk about clothing for a minute and just try and understand and unpack what exactly clothing should represent in an ordinary person's life, because that will help us to understand how we're going to apply it to the reality of the soul. So, do you need clothing in life? Think carefully before you answer this question. Do you need clothing? Now, I know that there are some fringe people out there who'll tell you, no, it's a convention of society and it's been imposed on us. Right? You don't really need clothing. Okay, we're not going to go down that route. The question is, do you need clothing? Well, the question is, who's you? If I'm talking about the human body, yes. The human body, unlike animals that have natural fur, the human body needs clothing in order to protect it from the cold, from the heat, from things that might injure the body, right? So you've got to wear clothes. You got to protect yourself. That's why you have to wear clothes. So no, you did not walk out of tonight's Tanya Shir advocating that we can go check out our wardrobe. You have to have clothes. The body requires clothes, but it's not just that. It's not just simply because it might be freezing cold outside, and so you have to wear a coat. There's another reason that you have to have clothes, and that's because it creates an appropriate interface between the person and society. So it's not just because it's a convention of society that people walk around wearing clothes as opposed to the animal kingdom who don't. It's more than that. Your clothing says something about you. Let's say, for argument's sake, if a person wears a uniform, So now we know something about their position in society. We know something about the service that they render or the occupation that they have. So that person wears a uniform. We know that if they instruct us to do something, we should probably follow because they represent the law. Or if you're looking for somebody to care for a person medically and you see a person who's wearing a medical practitioner's uniform, so you say, okay, so that's probably somebody that I could rely upon, and so on and so forth. Or let's try this for a second. Imagine that you were invited to a wedding. Now, I say imagine because when last were you invited to a wedding that was in person and not on Zoom? So let's just say that you imagine you were invited to a wedding, like in-person, real wedding, and you're a bit out of practice, right? Because it's been Zoom season for the last 18 months. So you're a little bit out of practice and you don't realize that weddings in real life, in person, you actually have to dress formally from top to bottom. Not like on Zoom, right? Where you've just got to put on a nice jacket and sit over here in front of the camera and then everything's good. Nobody's going to ask any questions about whether you're wearing long trousers or whatever because they just see this, right? Just got to make sure. Just remember that you're still on the Zoom so you don't go up and go get refreshment and then say, oops, okay. So let's say what would happen if a person forgot the convention and now went to this wedding and it was a very fancy black tie event and they arrived over there with their beautiful jacket, suit jacket, button-down shirt, and short Bermudas. Now what's going to happen at the wedding? Well, that person's going to be the laughingstock, obviously, of the entire crowd. Why? Because clothes are not only to protect the person in a physical sense, clothes create an appropriate interface between people in appropriate circumstances. So, at a formal event, you've got to wear formal clothing. On the other hand, imagine it was the exact reverse. Imagine that there was somebody who decided that they were going to have, it's going to be spring, so they're going to have this big spring party, and everybody should come over to the house to swim, and you decide you haven't been to a wedding in 18 months, so this is your time to put on your tux. It's going to be equally awkward, right? And the person will be as laughed at as if they had gone in the swimming costume to the formal wedding. Because clothing creates an appropriate interface to not just the world at large, but the specific part of the world that I have to interact with at this particular point in time. So if I don't have the right clothing on, it actually reflects poorly on me as a person, not just on my wardrobe. So yes, clothing are, in a sense, superficial because you could decide you don't like that jacket anymore, and you could decide to now give it away to a charity. And you'll be fine. You really will. You'll survive. Well. So on the one hand, clothing is absolutely disposable. And yet on the other hand, in context, clothing becomes a symbol of who you are. And that's why you might walk through the street and notice somebody who's dressed in a particularly eccentric way and say, wow, that might be a strange person. Because look at the way that they have dressed. So that's the irony of clothing. Clothing, on the one hand, is not me. It's absolutely disposable. I could rent a suit and give it back the next day, and I'll be fine. Yet, on the other hand, clothing, as the cliche goes, maketh the person, right? Clothing makes you, in a certain sense, it draws you out. Think about this for a second. Have you ever worn a uniform, any kind of a uniform? So perhaps you served in the military. Perhaps you were a part of a school where you had to wear a uniform. Perhaps you are in the medical fraternity, or you served as a police reservist, whatever. Okay, so many of us have had the opportunity to wear a uniform. What happens when you put on a uniform? What happens? You feel differently about yourself. Feel differently. If your uniform represents some kind of authority, you actually feel emboldened that now you have that authority because of what you're wearing. So isn't that fascinating? Here is this disposable external part of ourselves, well, not even part of us, part of our utilities that could have such a profound effect on ourselves. We're about to discover that the same kind of thing happens within the context of the soul. That we've got the parts that the soul uses, that's the way to say it, there's parts that the soul uses in order to be able to interface with the world. They're completely disposable, and we'll have to analyze exactly what that means, that they should be disposable. We'll call them the garments of the soul, but without them, the soul has no way to interface with the world around it, so they play a critical role. So they're not the soul. They're used by the soul. They are completely disposable, which means in the same way as you could throw out one suit and buy a new one, so a person could theoretically get rid of a whole set of these garments and replace them with brand new ones on the one hand, and on the other hand, they become the key to how the soul interfaces with the world. We're about to discover that the soul has 3 such garments, and knowing how to use them is going to be very useful for us to help us to understand how to maximize the experience of our soul and its impact on the world around it. So with that, we begin chapter 4. Chapter 4 starts with an interesting word. Yes, we know that in Hebrew, and particularly in Torah literature, it's not altogether uncommon to begin a sentence, or, as in this case, a chapter, with the word and. Your grammar teacher from high school might turn in her grave when she hears this, but that's the way it is in Torah literature. V. We start with the letter V. Now, there's a reason we do that. You have to remember that when the Alter Rebbe wrote this book of Tanya, he agonized over the language. He spent weeks at a time deciding exactly which word choice to use, and sometimes even a letter choice. So we've just come from the chapter that speaks about the internal workings of the soul, the substructure of the soul. 10 faculties, 3 of them are intellectual, 7 of them are so-called responsive or subjective. And following directly on from that, what we're about to study over here, yes, we're going to talk about disposable elements. So don't think that this is something totally standalone and unrelated to what we've learned before. There's a direct correlation, there's a conjunction between the 2 chapters. Everything we discovered in the previous chapter will rely on this chapter in order to have expression. So and they go hand in hand. Ve'oid, and furthermore. Okay. Oid is a word that you will find again in a lot of Torah literature. Oid, ve'oid, and furthermore, in other words, further to what we have already discussed up until this point. But in this particular chapter, the word ve'oid is selected because it has a dual meaning. Have you ever heard this? Ashira la Hashem b'chayoi. King David speaking. It's part of Baruch Nafshi, which we say on Rosh Chodesh. People sing it. It's become a whole song. Ashira la Hashem b'chayoi. I will sing to God in my life. Azamra lelokai be'oidi. And I will also sing. Azamra could possibly also mean a little bit more musical instruments. Be'oidi. Literal translation, as long as I am still here. Okay? But can you hear the word? Be'oidi, and here you've got the word ve'oid. There's a connection between the 2. For people who are familiar with Talmudic slang, are you familiar with Talmudic slang? See, if you spend enough years in yeshiva, then you come out and half your language has been replaced with Talmudic slang. Have you ever noticed this? You take these people who've gone through a very good school career, they've got a great command of English language, send them off to yeshiva for a few months, and they come back slurring everything with Yiddish phrases. Have you ever seen this? So anyhow, so Talmudic slang includes certain phrases that the Gemara uses in particular context, and we borrow it for all kinds of contexts. Here's one of them. So basically, there's a discussion in the Talmud, and the discussion is about a particular issue which is irrelevant to our conversation right now, and the best way to ever prove your view in the Talmud is to quote a verse from the Torah, because if you can quote a verse from the Torah that supports your view, nobody can argue with the Torah, right? So the Talmud quotes the verse, and then it quotes the opinion of one of the sages. Okay? And it's about a story of the people of Yehuda, Judea. Asks the Gemara, Yehuda ve'oid likra. Is Yehuda now like an accessory to the verse? The verse doesn't need an accessory. The verse can stand on its own 2 feet. It doesn't need any support. You hear the word again? Ve'oid. So you should start to pick up now that on the one hand we're saying ve'oid means and in addition to, but we're also implying in the same word that it's secondary. Something secondary. Ashira Lashem b'chayai. The main thing that King David says is I'll sing to God when I'm alive. Azamra lelokai be'oidi. And I will also sing while I am still in the physical form. Secondary. It's secondary. While I'm in the physical form, then I'll also praise God. Everything we learned in the previous chapter is about the core principles of how the soul works. Ve'oid. And furthermore, which also implies as a secondary element. Okay, now do you see how we're doing this? There is the core of the soul, and now there's something which is accessory to the soul, which we're about to discover, like clothes. There's the person, and then there's the clothing that the person wears. Yes, of course, your clothing does all kinds of wonderful things for you. It allows you to interact with the rest of the world. It allows you to interface, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, it is ve'oid. It's not you. It's an addendum to you. Ve'oid yesh l'chol nefesh elikis shloisha levushim. In addition to the 10 faculties on which the divine soul operates, it so happens that every single divine soul also has 3 garments. Now, the garments we're going to describe are not necessarily unique to the divine soul until we contextualize them. So we'll first identify what they are, and then we'll contextualize them straight away and say, now you'll see why they belong to the divine soul specifically. What are they? Sheheim, machshava, dibur, umaise. The 3 garments are thought, speech, and action. It's really important that we distinguish between intellect and thought. Big distinction. Thought is always running. Intellect, only by choice. So you don't pay attention to it, but you're always thinking. You're always thinking. All kinds of thoughts. It never stops. The expression that the sages use is machshava moshoitetes tamid. Machshava is always scanning. It's always moving. It's always looking. It's always thinking. So we don't pay attention necessarily to the thousands of thoughts that we have every single day, but they're cascading through our mind the whole day, every day, more and more and more and more and more thoughts. Thoughts do not have to be intelligent. That's the fact. That's why sometimes when you see a person who looks like they're completely spaced out, in spite of the fact that they might be an intelligent person, they could be completely spaced out. Because thoughts do not have to be intelligent. So we need to distinguish. When we discuss intellect, we're talking about a faculty of the soul. When we discuss thought, we're talking about a garment that the soul will use to process intellect. Where else do you process intellect? You process it in your thoughts. You also process other things in your thoughts. You actually process your emotions in your thoughts as well. You think about your emotions. You feel your emotions actually in your thoughts. So machshava is what we will call, much later on, the levush hapnimi. It's the undergarment. It's like the skin of the body. Skin is also a garment, right? Skin is also an external layer that's there to protect us from what's going on outside and also to allow us to interface with the rest of the world. Because, of course, we're wearing clothes on most of our body, but nobody's wearing clothes on our face. So this is the clothing of our face, the skin. How would you feel if somebody rocked up, God forbid, at your front door without their skin on? You know, it would be exactly. It would be like, bleh, to be completely repulsive. We wouldn't know how to respond to it. So that's like the levush hapnimi. It's also a kind of external, and it is external because skin is disposable. It replaces itself every 7 years, right from top to toe. You're constantly shedding skin all the time, and it's constantly regenerating because it can. Because it is disposable, but it's levush hapnimi, meaning to say it's very personal, it's very intimate, it's part of me, it's on me at all times, like my thoughts. They're always on me at all times. The only time that those thoughts shut down is when I close my eyes at night, and then they turn into the chaotic thoughts of dreams. As opposed to the other two garments, dibur and maise, speech and action, which are completely disposable. A person could theoretically go for days without using speech. We don't do it so much. But in other spiritual disciplines, people go for days on end, deliberately not speaking as part of their spiritual development. Because you can. Because it's a garment you don't have to wear. If the season is wrong, you don't have to wear that garment at all. And action is the most superficial of all the garments, because action is the one that a person does without thinking. So we don't sit here processing 1 second, raise arm 3 millimeters, turn angle 23 degrees, twist wrist. We don't do that, right? It just works. It just happens. Movement just happens, which is why it is possible for a person to do something as an action and not necessarily even be, well, in their minds, liable for it. So you're walking down the street, you don't even notice that you kicked the pebble that goes through the next person's windscreen. You don't notice because it wasn't intentional. So that's considered the most external of all of the garments. But what they all have in common is that they are a facilitation for the soul, to allow the soul to interface with the rest of the world. Like my skin allows me to interface with the rest of the world. If you think about it, why did God give us skin? Basically, so we wouldn't all freak out at each other. So we've got this external mask that allows us to look human. And then there are more superficial garments, like the clothing we wear on a normal basis, and then even more superficial garments, like, let's say, if you get dressed up for a particular event, or Purim, or because you're acting in a commercial or something like that. So these are garments that you put on just for that particular point in time. So the soul also has 3 garments, 3 different levels of disposability: thought, speech, action. But we're talking over here about the neshama. We're talking over here about the divine soul. So when is it a garment of the soul? For that we need context. Shel taryag mitzvos haTorah. When my thoughts are related somehow to Torah and mitzvahs. When I'm speaking about Torah and mitzvahs. When I'm doing a mitzvah. Then I can say that the garments of thought, speech, and action are being worn by the neshama. But if I'm speaking about or thinking about or doing other things, then those garments are being worn by the other soul. But we'll talk about it. We'll get into that in more detail later. But for now, all we need to know is this principle. That thinking about, speaking about, and doing Judaism is what creates the garments of the soul. So how does the soul interface with the world around us? When we think, speak, or do what Hashem wants. Now you might say, wow, that's mighty superficial. I wanted to hear my soul. I wanted to hear the resonance of my inner being. And all you're telling me is, something like, I don't know, wrap some animal hide around your arm in the morning. That doesn't feel soulful to me. Well, that's a big part of our journey, as we'll discover in greater detail through this chapter, the next chapter, and the beginning of the 6th chapter. All on this theme. Never underestimate the power of what these garments actually do for us. So just to translate it and kind of flesh it out. Pragmatically, what do we mean over here? When a person indeed fulfills any one of the 613 mitzvahs. Now, you all know, of course, that the 613 mitzvahs have many, many subcategories. So, in fact, it's a wide range of behaviors. So, when a person behaves in line with the requirements of the mitzvahs, Uvedibur hu oisek bepirish kol taryag mitzvos vehilcheseyen, or when a person uses their faculty of speech to discuss the meaning behind the mitzvahs, the laws of the mitzvahs, all that kind of detail, that is where my faculty of speech is directly linked to the neshama. Uve machshava hu masig kol ma she'efshar lo lahasig. Or when a person uses their thoughts as a process, as a tool for the intellect to explore and to comprehend everything that person is capable of comprehending. But Paradise HaTorah, in the 4 levels of the Torah, hold that thought. We'll come back to it. So in summary, when a person is doing mitzvahs, speaking about mitzvahs, or thinking about the meaning of the Torah, Hare klolus taryag evrei nafshoi. What then happens is that it turns out that not only does the soul have 10 faculties, but here's something fascinating. The soul also has 613 limbs. That basically means 613 sub-faculties. And those are meluvashim betariag mitzvos haTorah. Those become completely enclothed. That's the word, right? We're talking about clothing. We're talking about garments over here. So it becomes enclosed, invested in the 613 mitzvahs. Or befrat, to be a little bit more specific, bechinas chabad shebenafshoi, the intellectual components, chochma bin and das, which we discussed in the previous chapter, meluvashos bahasagas haTorah, they become mostly invested in the process of understanding Torah. Shehu maseg, how do you understand Torah? Bepardes, again, the 4 levels of Torah, which we haven't yet explained. Kefi yecholes hasagasoi v'shoresh nafshoi lemayla. And the way that you get to understand Torah depends on 2 things. It depends on yecholes hasagasoi, basically your intellectual capacity, and shoresh nafshoi lemayla, the source of your soul on high. Now, this is very interesting. There are 2 issues that we have to learn in what we've just read before we can move on to the next part of the chapter. One of them is this. What does that mean? That your appreciation of Torah is dependent on the faculties of intellect and the source of your soul. We also have to try and understand what these 4 levels of Torah are. So, in the time that we have, we'll touch on the one, and please God, next week, we'll explore the other. It makes sense. Anybody can understand and appreciate that if you want to learn something and you want to understand something intellectually, you have to use your intellect. Or to put it differently, the Gemara says, Chosh beroisha yasik b'Torah, that if a person has a headache, they should study Torah and it will relieve the headache. So there's a tongue-in-cheek version of what that means. It means that if a person is to learn Torah, they will soon enough discover that they don't really have a head. So if you don't really have a head, how could you have a headache? It goes without saying that in order to understand something, you have to have a little bit of a cup. So when he says, Kafi yecholes hasagasoi, basically what he's telling us is that the expectation of Torah learning is unique to each individual. No 2 people are expected to learn Torah the same way. We're all expected to do mitzvahs the same. I have to have as many mezuzahs on each doorway as you have to have. And I have to eat as much matzah on Pesach as you have to eat, etc. But when it comes to Torah learning, each of us is unique. Some of us gravitate more to Talmud, some of us more to mysticism, some of us more to the just basic laws, some of us love the history, some of us are more intelligent, some of us have a different educational background, and so it is absolutely personalized. Absolutely personalized, depending on the ability and capacity and style of your intellect. Basically what that means is, I cannot compare my success to somebody else's. I can't say I've learned more than them, therefore I'm doing fine. No. I have to have learned to the best of my ability. That's the key. And then he gives us the kicker. The style of your neshama will also cause you to gravitate to different parts of Torah. Here's a classic example. We know that 2 of the most famous Talmudic sages were Hillel and Shammai, and each one of them established a massive yeshiva. And Hillel's yeshiva took an approach where they looked for the more lenient aspect and perspective on every law in Torah, and Shammai took the stricter view every time. And Hillel attracted like-minded students, and Shammai attracted like-minded students, and the mystics tell us that all of Hillel's students had souls that came from the shoresh, from the soul source called chesed, leniency and tolerance. And Shammai attracted students whose soul source was gevura, which is high expectation and demand. The parts of Torah that we are required to learn, we have to feel that we resonate with certain parts of Torah for an inexplicable reason more than others. That's where we really have to invest our attention and our interest. So that's fascinating, right? That it's not just purely an intellectual pursuit. It has to do with the makeup of our soul, and that's where we belong spiritually. The last part that we have to just clear up before we can move in further into the chapter is what the 4 levels of Torah are. That deserves attention on its own. Please God, that's what we'll start next week.